In nearly every public conversation about Travis Decker's disappearance, one assumption has remained largely untouched, that he entered the forest alone, on foot, and never returned. It is the premise that has shaped the search, guided the media narrative, and informed the national manhunt. Yet, as the days turned into weeks and then months, alternative theories have begun to take shape. Theories that are not officially acknowledged, but quietly debated by those paying closer attention. At the heart of these theories is a single possibility that could unravel everything we think we know about the case. What if Decker never entered the forest at all? The notion may seem radical at first glance, especially given the vehicle discovered at the trailhead. His SUV, a gray 2013 Ford Escape, was found parked in a remote area of the Chelan National Forest. It was locked, its interior clean, no signs of struggle or distress. The engine was cold, the gas tank nearly half full. There were no visible footprints leading into the forest, no dropped items, no panic implied by the condition of the car. For a man supposedly fleeing authorities or suffering a psychological crisis, the calm and composed staging of that vehicle is the first in a long list of curiosities. The vehicle was parked front first toward the forest entrance, a seemingly small detail, but one worth examining. In high-stakes or emotionally charged situations, people often back their cars into parking spaces for a quicker exit. Travis, a former soldier trained in tactical movement, would almost certainly have known that. Parking front first in a location like that could be interpreted as a signal. He wasn't planning on needing a fast getaway. Or worse, it could suggest he never intended to drive away at all, because someone else was going to. This opens up the possibility that the vehicle was a decoy. In other words, the SUV wasn't abandoned as a last-ditch effort to escape. It was strategically placed to look abandoned. Its orientation toward the forest may have been a psychological breadcrumb left to lead authorities in the wrong direction. From that moment, every search effort and aerial scan may have been based on an intentional lie. Why is this possibility so rarely discussed by police officials? Some close to the investigation suggest it simply doesn't fit the established timeline or logic that law enforcement has come to rely on. But others wonder if dismissing the ghost vehicle theory is more than just procedural conservatism. Perhaps it represents a reluctance to entertain the idea that Decker may have had help, and that help could have come from inside the community, or worse, from within the very institutions trying to find him. One theory gaining traction in online circles and among amateur sleuths is the involvement of a second vehicle. Witnesses near the trailhead reported hearing an engine idling in the early morning hours of Decker's disappearance, but no second vehicle was ever found. No tire tracks were confirmed, though the area was hard-packed gravel and weather conditions at the time may have obscured subtle indicators. Still, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If someone was waiting for Decker, their timing would have had to be near perfect, suggesting coordination. If we entertain this idea for even a moment, the implications become serious. Decker would have had to orchestrate that second pickup in advance. He may have even spent time surveying the area, determining when and where cell coverage dropped off, and how long a vehicle could remain at the trailhead without raising suspicion. These are not the actions of a man in psychological freefall. They would point toward premeditation, structure, and calm under pressure, the kind of mindset that defines a former military operative acting with deliberate strategy. But if there was a second vehicle, who was in it? And why would they help Decker evade justice, knowing he was a person of interest in a high-profile case involving the death of his 3 daughters? That is where the conversation turns speculative, but not unreasonably so. Decker served 2 tours overseas and remained in contact with a small network of former military associates. Some of these individuals were described as highly private, living in secluded areas and working in specialized security roles. Could one of these individuals have provided assistance? Could loyalty to a fellow soldier have overridden their moral compass? It is equally possible that the second vehicle theory doesn't involve anyone from Decker's past, but rather someone he met in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Several local reports indicated he was seen speaking with strangers in small roadside cafes and remote gas stations, often lingering for hours with his phone turned off. This behavior was not reported immediately, and when it was dismissed as stress-related or incidental. But if these conversations were in fact part of planning a disappearance, they take on a new and ominous tone.
Why would law enforcement avoid exploring these threads? One explanation is resource limitation. Pursuing a second vehicle theory would stretch manpower thin, especially across a large and mountainous region. The second is political. Admitting the possibility of an accomplice could be seen as an admission that the initial assumptions were flawed and that the search may have started on the wrong foot. Third is the reputational risk. If a civilian, or worse, a member of law enforcement, played a role in Decker's escape, the fallout would be profound. There are also disturbing questions about surveillance gaps. The trailhead where Decker's car was found is not under 24/7 camera surveillance, but nearby forest access roads are sporadically monitored by state and federal trail cameras, mostly for wildlife activity. As of now, no such footage has been released publicly. Either no vehicle matching a second car was recorded, or such footage exists and has not been disclosed. In high-profile cases, this lack of transparency often leads to distrust and conspiracy thinking. But it may also be the result of red tape and interagency jurisdiction disputes. One retired deputy familiar with cases in the region pointed out that it wouldn't be difficult for a driver to enter and exit without being recorded. Quote, "If you know which gates stay open and when the rangers rotate shifts, you can come and go unnoticed, especially in the shoulder seasons when tourism drops and the trails are quiet." This aligns with the timeline of Decker's disappearance. It was just before peak summer, but after the spring thaw, a narrow window where conditions are passable but foot traffic remains low. Still, even with the mounting speculation, the idea of a ghost vehicle remains unverified. And yet, its plausibility grows the longer Decker remains missing without a trace. In most fugitive cases, a suspect either slips up within days or their body is found within weeks. The complete absence of physical evidence in Decker's case is not just rare, it's statistically baffling. Dogs have found no reliable scent trails, aerial surveillance has yielded nothing, and not a single confirmed sighting has placed Decker definitively inside the forest. That silence, so complete and enduring, may be telling its own story. There is a danger, of course, in over-theorizing. But there is also danger in ignoring alternate possibilities because they're uncomfortable or politically inconvenient. If Decker did stage his disappearance, if a second vehicle was involved, and if the entire search has been based on a manipulated scene, then this case is not a wilderness survival story. It is a calculated evasion. And until law enforcement re-examines the assumptions baked into their narrative, they may continue searching in the wrong place for the wrong reasons, while the man they seek is long gone.
June 15th was the day authorities believe Travis Decker entered the vast wilderness of the Cascade Mountains. But the real question isn't just whether Decker ran, hid, or was helped. It's how the environment itself played a role. Nature, in its rawest and most unpredictable form, may have done more to erase Decker's trail than any human plan ever could. That day wasn't marked by dramatic storms or torrential rain. Instead, it was deceptively ordinary, even calm, and that calmness may have been Decker's greatest advantage. The weather on June 15, 2025 in Chelan County was, by most accounts, unremarkable. Temperatures ranged in the mid-70s during the day and dipped into the low 40s by nightfall. There was no recorded rainfall, and skies remained mostly overcast, though not pitch dark. But beneath that seemingly benign forecast lay the exact conditions that could foil even the most organized search. Wind was one of the most critical environmental factors working against law enforcement that day. Gusts in the area reached up to 30 miles per hour in open stretches, with intermittent pockets of strong air movement cutting through the trees. For human searchers, this meant a constant rustling of branches and vegetation, making it difficult to hear subtle sounds that might indicate movement. But for tracking dogs, it was even worse. Scent trails, especially fresher ones, rely on still or consistent air patterns to carry and retain olfactory signatures. The shifting wind likely distorted, dispersed, or entirely erased Decker's trail. If he moved against the wind or timed his travel between gusts, he could have remained undetectable to canine units following hours later. Add to this the absence of rain, and suddenly the terrain becomes a challenge in a completely different way. While mud can sometimes obscure tracks, it also preserves them when pressure is applied. Dry ground, especially the kind found on higher elevations and forest paths, offers little evidence of recent movement. The soil in the region is mixed with loose gravel, pine needles, and dead leaves, all of which shift easily underfoot and quickly reset in the wind. If Decker chose his steps carefully, avoided soft patches, or simply moved through areas where natural debris masked any footprint, his physical trace would vanish almost instantly. Aerial searches were also hindered by the forest canopy. The Cascades are home to towering Douglas firs, dense underbrush, and layers of overlapping foliage. On a day with clearer skies, drones and helicopters can use visual cues, movement, disturbed branches, even color contrast to identify human presence. But on June 15th, the overcast skies muted the light, reducing contrast and shadow differentiation. Combined with the thick treetops, drones were essentially flying blind in many parts of the range. Without heat signals strong enough to stand out or visible motion from above, Travis could have been beneath a blanket of leaves and shadows the entire time, undetected not by skill but by natural cover. Then there's the temperature drop. By late evening, Chelan County temperatures dipped into the low 40s, not freezing, but enough to induce hypothermia over time for an unprepared person. This, however, assumes Travis was unprepared. If, on the other hand, he had a thermal blanket, lightweight shelter, or even layered clothing in a hidden pack nearby, he could have ridden out the cold with minimal risk. The fact that no such supplies were found at his car suggests they may have already been placed elsewhere. This detail raises further questions. Did he make a drop in advance? Did someone else plant gear deeper into the woods for him? Or did he carry it off himself immediately after leaving the vehicle?
One theory speculates that Travis may have deliberately chosen that specific weather window. The combination of wind, overcast skies, and mild dryness may have looked ideal to someone planning a disappearance. A storm would have brought helicopters and a limited search due to safety risks. Clear skies would have offered better visibility from above. But this in-between condition, not dangerous yet subtly obstructive, gave Decker the perfect slipstream to vanish into. This wasn't luck. It could have been premeditated environmental manipulation. More importantly, the weather limited the initial timeline in which any viable tracking could occur. Scent trails grow cold fast, and the wind, especially if Decker walked along or across ridgelines, would have scattered them across impossible distances. K9 units operate best under stable conditions with some moisture in the air or ground. June 15 had neither. By the time dogs were deployed, likely hours after his disappearance, there would have been nothing substantial to follow. This wasn't just Decker escaping human pursuit. It was him vanishing into an atmospheric void. Additionally, the absence of footprints on the dry terrain wasn't just a coincidence. In many forested areas, fallen pine needles create a natural cushion that bounces back after pressure. Unless someone steps into muddy soil or displaces rocks, there's little to no track left behind. Even experienced trackers struggle under these conditions. And if Decker followed game trails or pre-existing footpaths known only to locals or hunters, he could have traveled miles before anyone narrowed the perimeter. Then there's the matter of scent drift. Strong wind doesn't just disperse scent, it pushes it in unpredictable directions. A canine team picking up Decker's trail at one spot may have been misled miles away in the wrong direction due to redirected scent particles. Search grids, based on logic and terrain, suddenly become faulty if olfactory data leads searchers away from the actual path. This may explain why multiple agencies came up empty despite combing the same sectors repeatedly. Thermal detection, too, was hindered. Overcast lighting often results in even temperatures across a forest floor. Without clear sunlight to warm certain areas and highlight thermal differences, it becomes harder for FLIR, or thermal imaging, to pick up human heat signatures. And if Decker found a sheltered spot, under a boulder, inside a small cave, or wrapped in a reflective blanket, his heat signature would have been nullified. One wrong assumption about how well these tools work under imperfect conditions could have made all the difference. Taken together, the environmental conditions of June 15 didn't just assist Decker, they may have shielded him completely. The notion that a man can simply walk into the woods and vanish feels like folklore, but in this case, it's disturbingly plausible. If he did indeed plan for those very conditions, or even if he stumbled upon them by chance, the effect is the same. A man lost to wind, shadows, and silence. Perhaps most haunting is this: the more time passes, the more that window of advantage hardens into myth. The wind no longer blows the same way. The scent is long gone. The skies may open or close, but they're not June 15 again. Search teams are chasing echoes, not footsteps. And the mountain, like the weather that day, remains indifferent, quiet, and resolute in its concealment.
The manhunt for Travis Decker, launched shortly after the discovery of his abandoned vehicle on June 15th, unfolded with urgency on the surface, but under the hood, critical missteps in the first hours may have carved an escape route that will never be closed. Much of the public remains unaware of just how fragile the operation was in its infancy. Behind the scenes, the coordination between agencies stumbled, technology underperformed, and the physical search perimeter lagged behind what the circumstances demanded. In any high-stakes fugitive case, the window between discovery and containment is razor-thin. That window widened in Decker's case. One of the most underexamined aspects of the search effort lies in how slowly the perimeter was established around the last known location. Authorities were reacting to a scene, not actively containing a suspect. The vehicle was found parked facing the woods, unlocked, with no signs of distress. In hindsight, this eerie calm should have accelerated efforts, not slowed them. Yet by the time units were mobilized, a wide section of terrain was left vulnerable, offering an experienced outdoorsman like Decker multiple exit paths. Locals say they saw only minimal presence in the first few hours. By then, the horse had likely already left the barn. Perhaps even more damaging than the physical gaps in the perimeter were the bureaucratic ones. Local law enforcement, state officers, and federal agencies were not aligned in the crucial first 6 hours. Radio traffic from the early hours, while not made fully public, reportedly shows confusion over who was in charge of what zone, what equipment was on hand, and what protocols to follow. With no unified command, early leads, such as potential trail prints, broken brush, or subtle disturbances, were left unpreserved or unnoticed. The sheer volume of terrain compounded this problem. Rather than being divided methodically, areas were checked haphazardly as different teams arrived with overlapping orders.
This level of disorganization in the face of an urgent manhunt is not merely a mistake, it is an operational failure. Then came the delay in deploying canine units. By the time scent dogs were brought in, the area around Decker's vehicle had likely been contaminated by foot traffic, tires, and the natural effects of wind and sun. One canine handler, speaking anonymously, expressed frustration with being called in hours late and finding the scene in what they described as a stomped-down mess of overlapping scent. This detail raises real questions. Were decision-makers slow to approve the use of canines, or was there simply no immediate resource available? In either case, the lapse may have eliminated the most organic trail Decker left behind. A scent trail grows cold fast, especially under warm conditions and wind. Even if he had headed into the forest, the dogs never had a fair shot at tracking him. Air surveillance, too, which should have played a central role, was crippled early on. Fog and dense tree canopy reportedly interfered with thermal imaging, but observers noted that helicopters were not in the air within the first hour. A window when body heat still radiates more distinctly, even in natural cover. Thermal drones and FLIR-equipped aircraft only became active several hours in. Some argue this was a function of logistics. Equipment had to be called in from neighboring jurisdictions. But that also underscores how unprepared the local command was to deal with a rapid backwoods escape. Given the known volatility of Decker's mindset and the gravity of what he was suspected of, that level of unpreparedness borders on negligence.
The biggest question, however, is whether Decker was even within the area law enforcement fixated on. If he had help, a possibility quietly acknowledged but publicly dismissed, then the perimeter might have been chasing a ghost. But even without assistance, it's plausible that Decker slipped through the early gaps during the first 6 hours of confusion. By the time the grid was tightened, he may have already reached a safe zone, either deeper into the wilderness or toward a secondary staging point. A survivalist by reputation, he may have known where the soft spots were. With just a few hours head start and knowledge of the land, he could have used terrain and distance to stay out of reach indefinitely. Several independent observers and retired law enforcement analysts have since raised concerns that officials are withholding specific information about those early hours, not necessarily to deceive the public, but to avoid embarrassment. There are no public transcripts of the early radio communications. No footage has been released from early drone flights. And no accountability has been laid on whoever was in command of those critical initial decisions. In many ways, it appears the agencies involved are more focused on showing a united front than on explaining what went wrong. It raises the uncomfortable possibility that internal politics may be eclipsing operational truth. Adding to this opacity is the silence around intra-agency conflict. Insiders suggest that disagreements between the RCMP and provincial wilderness officers about how to proceed led to duplication of efforts and gaps in coverage. One report suggests a region northeast of the vehicle was never swept during the first day because each group assumed the other had done it. It's these blind spots that Decker may have exploited, not necessarily by being lucky, but by sensing the very chaos unfolding behind him. Even the public communication strategy added to the fog. Initial press releases described the search as coordinated and multi-agency, giving the impression of seamless action. But eyewitnesses near the search zone described scattered vehicles, searchers milling with unclear directions, and long gaps between activity. One local, a former SAR volunteer, claimed he saw no infrared drones for nearly 8 hours and no scent dogs until that evening. For someone familiar with backcountry maneuvers, those delays were more than enough to create distance. Another concerning element is the apparent lack of contingency planning.
Once it became clear Decker wasn't going to be found quickly, there was no visible shift in strategy. Days later, search grids were being rechecked, something that often signals a lack of fresh intelligence. The manhunt, instead of evolving, seemed to repeat itself. That circular approach may have consumed valuable time and energy, while Decker, if he had escaped, settled into a hide site or moved farther afield. The fact that he left no trail might be less about his cleverness and more about law enforcement's initial disarray. Of course, the question lingers: if these flaws were so evident, why hasn't there been a formal review? Public confidence is closely tied to the belief that authorities are operating competently and transparently. But in the Decker case, there has been an unusual level of silence around early missteps. Is that silence protecting reputations, or is it shielding the public from the uncomfortable reality that this fugitive vanished not just because he was skilled, but because the system around him cracked under pressure? Ultimately, Decker's escape, if it was indeed an escape, was likely one in the early hours. And what those hours reveal is not just a timeline, but a systemic failure of communication, readiness, and decisiveness. While public attention may drift toward the drama of survival in the woods, the more grounded story is one of human error, organizational blind spots, and missed opportunities that may never be regained.
In the earliest days of the Travis Decker manhunt, much of the effort was concentrated on the dense forest believed to be his point of entry. Authorities treated it as a containment problem, but what if the assumption was flawed from the beginning? What if Decker never intended to remain hidden in the wilderness and instead used the initial chaos as a diversion while moving rapidly and intentionally in a different direction, toward the border? The possibility that Travis Decker fled the country, particularly into Canada, is not far-fetched. On the contrary, it's one of the more plausible routes for a man who knew he'd be hunted and had reason to disappear permanently. Geographically, Decker's last verified sighting placed him in an area within a few hours' drive of multiple border crossings into Canada. Less than 250 miles separated his presumed position and the international boundary, with significant stretches of that terrain made up of rural highways, mountainous passes, and indigenous lands, many of which are not closely monitored. U.S.-Canada crossings are notoriously porous in certain regions, and historically, this border has been used for both legal and illicit crossings. Smugglers, undocumented migrants, and fugitives have long exploited the isolated forest trails that wind through this vast, lightly patrolled frontier. Travis Decker, with outdoor knowledge and strong motivation, could have done the same. Critically, there is no known passport activity linked to Decker following the issuance of the Amber Alert and the nationwide law enforcement notification. But that's only half the picture. Most of the land-based crossings in the region, especially those not connected to major highways, do not require passports to be checked electronically, unless a person voluntarily presents themselves at an official border station. If Decker crossed in the backcountry, he likely bypassed customs altogether. This is not a high-tech surveillance wall like the U.S.-Mexico border. In many areas of the northern border, especially in Vermont, Maine, and parts of the upper Midwest, there's nothing stopping a person from slipping across on foot. There's no fencing, no sensors, and often not even a visible line. The fact that no customs alert was publicly issued raises further questions. If the working theory was that he might flee internationally, why wasn't the public warned to be on alert at rest stops, bus terminals, or backcountry stations leading toward Canada? Was it a tactical decision to avoid tipping him off? Or was it a bureaucratic oversight? Whatever the case,
The lack of visibility and transparency around this question has fueled growing suspicions that law enforcement did not fully prepare for an international flight scenario in the early phase. Timing also works in Decker's favor. He was believed to have entered the forest the morning of June 15th, but the manhunt only fully mobilized several hours later. If he had a vehicle stashed nearby, perhaps even preloaded with supplies and parked beyond the presumed containment zone, he could have doubled back undetected and made significant distance before law enforcement even began setting up their perimeter. From there, he would only need a driver or a contact willing to meet him and take him the rest of the way.
One scenario suggests that Decker may have coordinated with someone ahead of time, possibly a person with knowledge of the rural road networks or tribal territories that run along the U.S.-Canada border. These regions are not only hard to patrol, but they also offer legal complexity. Many tribal lands maintain a form of semi-sovereignty, and law enforcement presence may be minimal unless there's cooperation. That creates a gray zone, not lawless, but difficult to navigate for traditional tracking methods. If Decker crossed through one of these areas, it could explain how he escaped notice. There's also the possibility that someone sympathetic to Decker, a relative, friend, or like-minded acquaintance, assisted him either by driving him across or by providing false documents. Identity fraud, while increasingly difficult in the digital age, is not impossible, especially if someone has access to dormant identities, black market vendors, or communities that are less integrated with national ID systems. If Decker shaved his beard, changed his clothing, and assumed a different name, it's feasible that he could have passed for someone else. Without biometric flagging at most Canadian land borders, and with no active warrant listed internationally until days later, he may not have even triggered suspicion. Another plausible outcome is that Decker is not on the move anymore, but rather hiding in a rural or semi-off-grid location within Canada. Shelters, religious communities, or fringe survivalist groups often operate outside major cities, and some intentionally avoid contact with modern systems. It wouldn't be the first time a fugitive found safe harbor with an isolated or ideologically motivated group. Even without such an alliance, the sheer size of Canada's wilderness regions means a solo survivalist could, in theory, blend in with minimal interference, especially in summer months. What lends weight to this border theory is not just what might have happened, but what hasn't happened. Despite weeks of searching, no confirmed sightings of Decker have emerged. No digital trace has been found, no cell activity, no credit card use, no gas station footage. That kind of total disappearance suggests either death or extreme intent to vanish. And if he's not in the original forest zone, as many now believe, then the next logical possibility is that he went far, much farther than the perimeter teams anticipated. Why would he flee to Canada instead of remaining in the U.S.? Several reasons align. First, the linguistic and cultural overlap makes it easier for an American to adapt there than in other countries. Second, extradition is not automatic. While Canada and the U.S. have a long-standing extradition treaty, not all charges qualify, and the process is slow and subject to legal challenge. Third, Canada has vast unpopulated regions where off-grid living is more feasible, especially during summer. If Decker intended to disappear for months or years, heading north offers unique advantages. There's also the possibility that he wanted to follow a route deeper, using Canada not as the destination, but as a corridor. Some have speculated that Decker may aim for northern ports or even remote airfields with the intent of eventually leaving North America altogether. This theory, though less likely, gains traction if one assumes Decker had help from a larger network. While no such ties have been uncovered, the level of planning required for such a maneuver would suggest long-term foresight. Of course, all of this hinges on one major assumption, that Decker is still alive. The longer authorities go without a trace, the more the question of whether he perished in the wilderness looms over every alternate theory. Still, the border hypothesis remains compelling precisely because it explains the silence. If Decker made it into Canada and has remained offline, out of major population centers and away from legal trouble, the odds of detecting him decrease dramatically. In such a case, authorities may not even be able to locate him without outside help or a critical mistake on his part. Ultimately, the lack of transparency from law enforcement on this issue only fuels public speculation. Have they searched nearby Canadian provinces thoroughly? Have they alerted Canadian law enforcement to look for forged identities, underground sheltering communities, or recent passport applications using look-alike photos? Have border surveillance systems been checked retroactively? Or are investigators too wedded to the forest theory to seriously explore this path? In high-stakes manhunts, it's often the unexamined theory, the one deemed improbable or inconvenient, that turns out to be the key. If Travis Decker crossed that border and no one was watching, it may already be too late to bring him back. And unless authorities act on that possibility decisively, this mystery may remain unsolved for a very long time.
The longer Travis Decker remains unfound, the more plausible it becomes that he is not merely hiding, but being hidden. A subtle yet crucial distinction that suggests outside assistance, perhaps even a deliberate and well-orchestrated protection system. This theory, gaining quiet traction in both public speculation and certain investigative corners, proposes that Decker is not alone in his evasion. He may be embedded within or shielded by an underground group, not unlike networks observed in previous fugitive cases. These are not mythical cabals or fanciful conspiracies, but loosely connected, ideologically aligned cells or communities that operate outside the grid, supporting individuals they perceive as targets of government overreach, unjust systems, or moral ambiguity. Whether this network is ideologically driven, financially compensated, or simply loyal to Decker through personal ties remains speculative, but several red flags suggest it cannot be ruled out. Historically, fugitives have occasionally survived for years with help from survivalist or separatist networks, informal collectives of people who share anti-government sentiments, a rejection of modern surveillance, and a reverence for self-sufficiency. These groups often dwell in rural or forested areas, utilize bartering systems, and possess extensive knowledge of off-grid survival techniques. Some are motivated by ideology, others by a sense of kinship or protectionism for their own. In such a world, someone like Travis Decker, a man whose actions shocked the public, but who might be reframed by certain ideologues as resisting a corrupt world, could be taken in, not as a criminal, but as a symbol. The narrative could shift behind closed doors, not that he murdered his daughters, but that he escaped a system that had already failed him. Such reframing has occurred before, particularly in communities where facts are filtered through conspiracy or spiritual reinterpretation. Multiple indicators hint at the existence of such supportive scaffolding. In the weeks after the incident, scattered reports emerged from rural outposts of people discreetly removing wanted posters. While these stories were dismissed by some as unrelated vandalism or coincidence, the patterns appeared too deliberate to ignore. Some posters weren't merely torn, they were peeled, their adhesives removed, with no scraps left behind, suggesting intention, not mischief. In one case, an entire cluster of missing person posters from a central bulletin board was gone overnight, while nearby advertisements and public notices remained untouched. It was as if someone had specifically targeted those images and messages, not for defacement, but erasure. This aligns disturbingly well with the theory of a support network.
Whether organized through encrypted digital communication or a decentralized word-of-mouth system, a loyal group might undertake such actions to remove psychological pressure from Decker or keep the spotlight from growing too hot in certain zones. Consider also that no significant digital trace of Decker has been found since the night of the murders. Not a pinged phone tower, not a recorded credit card transaction, not a fingerprinted supply run, nothing. While that could imply a well-prepared solo survivalist, it also raises the question, what if his online identity, physical traces, and even potential communications are being actively suppressed, not just by him, but by people skilled in operational secrecy?
In past cases involving eco-activist fugitives or anti-tax dissidents, safe house trails were discovered years later, makeshift housing systems spanning multiple counties, consisting of cabins, farms, and RVs provided by sympathizers. These stops often supplied basic sustenance, news updates, burner phones, new clothing, and sometimes even new identities. The individuals who offered these havens were rarely financially compensated. Instead, they believed they were doing something righteous, shielding someone they saw as persecuted, misunderstood, or revolutionary. That kind of loyalty may seem far-fetched to outsiders, but it has precedent. One only needs to study cases like Eric Rudolph, who hid in the woods of North Carolina for years after committing acts of domestic terrorism, aided at times by a network that believed his ideology justified his actions. Decker's potential entry into such a network doesn't require grand conspiracy. Only one or two connections, a handful of sympathizers, perhaps met through online platforms or at in-person meetings during his previous life. Some suggest he may have communicated on fringe internet forums, encrypted messaging platforms, or prepper-based social media spaces prior to the murders. While no public evidence confirms this, investigators have not denied the possibility. In fact, the RCMP has remained unusually silent regarding the digital forensics of Decker's personal devices. That silence could be strategic, withholding details from the public to preserve tactical advantage, or, more ominously, it may reflect the scope of the problem, a digital clean slate that feels too thorough to have been done alone. Adding fuel to the underground network theory is the idea of ideology-based adoption. In recent years, there has been an uptick in communities across North America, ranging from sovereign citizen movements to extreme survivalist collectives who not only distrust law enforcement, but outright deny its legitimacy. In such circles, conventional morality is sometimes replaced with tribal or personal codes of justice. If Decker had embedded himself in one of these belief systems, even partially, it's possible he fostered relationships that would serve him now. People in these groups have been known to provide safe houses, alternate identities, and untraceable supplies to those they believe have been targeted by the government. The nature of Decker's crime, while incomprehensible to most, could be reimagined by such a group as a tragic but necessary break from a corrupt system. If that sounds implausible, remember that in echo chambers where all external reality is distrusted, even the darkest events can be rewritten into narratives of victimhood. The idea that Decker is receiving aid is strengthened further by logistical inconsistencies. The physical terrain and climate in which he vanished are harsh, but not impenetrable. Survival in such regions without any help would be taxing even for the most seasoned outdoorsman, let alone someone with no clear indication of extensive backcountry training. Yet weeks have passed with no sign of bodily deterioration, discarded supplies, campsite debris, or heat signatures. No alerts from rural hospitals, no dental matches, no camera footage. That kind of vanishing act requires planning, or more likely, assistance. Whether he was picked up at a designated extraction point, swapped vehicles, or simply melted into an RV remains unknown.
but it's increasingly hard to believe he simply ran into the woods with a backpack and vanished forever. Some online sleuths have mapped potential underground travel corridors Decker could have used, not just physical, but social. In these models, Decker's route is less about terrain and more about trust. Families off-grid in distant counties, barn lofts owned by retirees with libertarian leanings, religious compounds that resist cooperation with state agencies. These are often tight-knit, insular communities where strangers are unwelcome, but friends of the cause receive quiet sanctuary. If Decker had even a single ally among these groups, he could be passed along, out of the line of sight, re-outfitted at each stop, his face shaved, altered, or disguised. Even now he could be on the fourth or fifth handoff, steadily moving away from his point of origin. Perhaps the most disturbing implication of this theory is the idea that Decker's aid may not be purely ideological. There's also the possibility he paid for protection. Underground services that offer escape routes for a price do exist, albeit in the shadows. These facilitators often have backgrounds in illicit trades, people smugglers, ex-military operatives, rogue hackers, and they don't ask questions. If Decker liquidated his assets prior to the murders, even partially, he may have secured passage and anonymity through black market channels. In this model, Decker is less of a fugitive and more of a ghost client, off the radar because someone was paid to make him vanish. Still, no theory is without holes. If Decker is being helped, those aiding him risk severe legal consequences. Harboring a fugitive, especially one wanted for the suspected murder of children, is a federal offense in most countries. So why take the risk? The answer may lie in either shared ideology or complete disconnection from the moral consensus. In some cloistered corners of society, the outside world is seen as irredeemable, its laws illegitimate, and its narratives false. A person like Decker could be viewed through a twisted lens, not as a monster, but as someone escaping a broken world. Ultimately, the underground network theory may prove true, partly true, or entirely speculative. But in a case where a man suspected of killing his 3 daughters has evaded capture for this long, with no credible sightings, no clear trail, no forensic leakage, the idea that he had help must be taken seriously. It is not only possible, it might be the only thing that explains why he has not yet been found.
There are few things more unsettling to a public already rattled by horror than silence, especially from institutions tasked with protecting them. In the case of Travis Decker, the silence is not just persistent, but increasingly conspicuous. As media outlets continue to investigate the timeline, the evidence, and the psychological profile of the man believed to have murdered his 3 daughters before vanishing into the wilderness or beyond, a darker truth begins to emerge. We may not be hearing everything. In fact, the most critical pieces of this case may be buried not in the forest, but in case files that have been sealed, redacted, or simply never disclosed to the public. For many watching the story unfold, it's not just the tragedy that disturbs them, but the growing sense that they're being kept deliberately in the dark. Almost immediately after Decker's disappearance, independent journalists and civilian researchers began filing Freedom of Information Act requests in the hope of piecing together what law enforcement wouldn't say directly. Many of these requests focused on the first 48 hours, traditionally the most vital window in any manhunt. Yet nearly every document returned came back with massive redactions. In many cases, entire paragraphs were blacked out, timestamps were removed, sections referencing third-party involvement or possible sighting reports were completely omitted. And when challenged, police departments and state officials responded with vague language about protecting the integrity of an ongoing investigation, or, more cryptically, community safety. There's no question that withholding certain details is sometimes necessary,
No professional expects law enforcement to reveal everything in real time. But what we're seeing in the Decker case appears to go far beyond the standard operational discretion. In particular, several key components of the investigation remain completely opaque. One of the most baffling absences is the forensic profile of the vehicle Travis left behind. According to authorities, the vehicle was found abandoned just outside the primary search radius. It was towed, processed for evidence, and impounded. Yet what was or wasn't found inside has never been revealed. No inventory, no lab reports, no mention of biological materials, even though there are rumors that blood was visible on the steering column. To this day, no official confirmation has been made about whether any DNA not belonging to Travis was recovered from that car. Just as troubling are the reports from local journalists, some of whom have spoken off-record about being warned, directly or indirectly, not to publish theories involving accomplices. One crime correspondent from a mid-sized local paper says her editor received a phone call from a government liaison stating that the outlet should avoid reckless speculation about external actors. This happened only days after she submitted a story examining the possibility that Decker had help disappearing, including questions about someone possibly disabling surveillance cameras on a remote service road he may have traveled. The story never ran. It was pulled hours before publication with no explanation, and the journalist was told to pivot to community response angles. This in turn raises another important question. What surveillance footage has been reviewed, and why hasn't any been released? Many small towns and rural regions rely on Department of Transportation cameras, toll booths, private security systems, and trail cameras placed by residents and hunters. In the age of ubiquitous surveillance, it would seem statistically unlikely that no footage of Decker has surfaced since his alleged escape. Yet not a single confirmed image or video clip has been provided to the public. Not even a blurry figure on the edge of a road. Are we to believe he vanished into thin air? Or is it possible some footage exists, but is being withheld for reasons we're not being told?
Then there are the reports of potential accomplices, which authorities have neither confirmed nor fully denied. Shortly after the search for Decker began, social media lit up with claims that a white pickup truck had been seen lingering in the area where his vehicle was later found. One resident claimed to have seen someone matching Decker's general description being picked up along an old utility path, yet when local volunteers returned to that area with drones and dogs, they were turned away by law enforcement. Another source, a retired ranger who asked to remain anonymous, said he heard from an active duty officer that a set of boot prints at the edge of a ravine suggested two individuals had been walking side by side before one set disappeared. None of this has ever been addressed in any press conference. There's also the matter of Decker's personal belongings. The public was told early on that only his car had been found, but months later, in a quietly edited statement on a local law enforcement website, it was stated that a partial clothing item believed to belong to Decker had been recovered roughly 5 miles from the vehicle. Why was this detail omitted for months? What does partial mean? Was the item torn, burned, blood-stained? Once again, no photo, no confirmation, no lab report, just a passive mention buried deep in a report most people never read. If the item had been clean, mundane, or irrelevant, why withhold the detail until curiosity died down? Perhaps the most chilling information comes from anonymous sources within law enforcement itself. Multiple reporters across 3 outlets have cited unnamed officers who claim there are elements of this case too disturbing to be released to the public. These statements are vague by design, but they've ignited widespread speculation. Does this refer to the condition of the victims' bodies? A potential manifesto or writings found in Decker's home? Communications with other individuals before or after the incident? Or something more frightening, evidence that suggests this wasn't an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern. When viewed collectively, these omissions and obfuscations begin to resemble not oversight, but strategy. The suppression of evidence isn't always about misdirection. Sometimes it's about containment. Law enforcement may be dealing with variables they can't fully explain or control, such as possible links to extremist ideology, digital coordination, or even international assistance. The decision to keep such possibilities quiet could stem from a fear of creating public panic or inspiring copycats. Yet history has shown that in high-profile fugitive cases, transparency, when done responsibly, often aids the investigation more than it hinders it. Some experts believe the sheer scale of the manhunt may have paralyzed departments into silence. Multiple jurisdictions are now involved: local police, state agencies, the U.S. Marshals, and possibly even federal cybersecurity divisions. Coordination becomes messy. Protocols overlap. No single agency wants to be the first to release information that might compromise another's angle. This is understandable from a bureaucratic standpoint, but it's created a situation where the public no longer trusts the story they're being told. People are filling in the blanks themselves, and not always in rational ways. What we're left with is a mystery increasingly defined not by what we know, but by what's missing. A suspect with no confirmed sightings, a car processed with no disclosed findings, a series of redacted documents and silenced reporters, a handful of insiders hinting that the truth might be too big or too ugly to share. Whether this silence is tactical, negligent, or protective remains unclear. But until the gap between what law enforcement knows and what the public is told begins to close, that silence will continue to speak volumes. And each day it does, it erodes trust, until the case becomes not just about a murderer who vanished, but about the secrets left behind.